We all know the story, right? No taxation without representation, the Boston Tea Party, Paul Revere's Ride. These are the headline acts of the American Revolution, the stories we learn in school. But what if I told you that the real reasons America broke away from Britain were deeper, more complex, and in some ways far more personal than just a squabble over taxes? Today we're pulling back the curtain on the untold causes behind America's fight for independence. Let's start with something you might not expect: land. After the French and Indian War, which was a huge, costly conflict for the British Empire, King George III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This imaginary line drawn along the Appalachian Mountains forbade colonists from settling west of it. For Britain, this was a practical move. It was meant to prevent conflicts with Native American tribes, which would be expensive to manage, and to keep the colonists contained along the coast, where they were easier to govern and tax. But for the American colonists, this was a slap in the face. Many had fought in that very war with the expectation of gaining access to the vast, fertile lands of the Ohio Valley. Land ownership wasn't just about wealth, it was the foundation of liberty and social mobility in colonial America. To be told that the very land they believed they had earned was now off limits felt like a betrayal. This wasn't just an economic issue, it was a clash of destinies. The colonists saw a boundless continent ripe for expansion, while Britain saw a tidy, manageable territory. This fundamental disagreement over the future of the continent planted some of the earliest, deepest seeds of resentment. Next, let's talk about money, but not just taxes. Colonies were trapped in an economic system called mercantilism. The whole point of a colony, in Britain's eyes, was to enrich the mother country. The Navigation Acts, for instance, required that most colonial goods be shipped on British vessels and passed through British ports. This meant that colonial producers, whether they were Virginia tobacco farmers or New England lumberjacks, had to sell their goods to British merchants, who would then re-export them to Europe at a markup. This system effectively stifled American manufacturing and forced colonists to buy expensive finished goods from Britain. Imagine you're a skilled artisan in Philadelphia. You're perfectly capable of making high-quality furniture or tools, but you're forced to compete with imported British products that have a protected market. It created a constant drain of wealth from the colonies back to England, leaving many colonists, even prominent ones, in a state of perpetual debt to British creditors. This economic dependency felt less like a partnership and more like exploitation, fostering a growing desire for economic self-determination. Now, let's wade into the messy world of smuggling. Because of those strict trade laws, smuggling wasn't just a criminal activity. It was a way of life and a form of economic resistance. John Hancock, one of the most famous signatories of the Declaration of Independence, was also one of the wealthiest merchants. In New England, and a significant portion of his fortune was built on smuggling molasses, wine, and other goods to avoid British duties. He wasn't the exception. He was the norm for successful colonial merchants. When Britain began to crack down, it wasn't just about lost revenue. They introduced writs of assistance, which were essentially open-ended search warrants, allowing customs officials to search any ship, warehouse, or even private home they suspected of holding smuggled goods. To the colonists, who cherished the English tradition that a man's home is his castle, this was an outrageous violation of their personal liberties. The legal battle against these writs, led by lawyer James Otis, was a major turning point, framing the conflict not just as an economic dispute, but as a fight for fundamental rights. This brings us to a really fascinating and often overlooked factor: the clash of identities. Over the 150 years since the first settlements, a distinct American identity had begun to form. People in Massachusetts didn't see themselves as being the same as people in Georgia, but they all increasingly saw themselves as different from the British. They were shaped by a different environment, a different social structure, and a different set of experiences. This was amplified by the Great Awakening, a series of religious revivals that swept through the colonies in the mid-18th century. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield emphasized a personal, emotional connection to God, challenging the authority of the established, state-sponsored churches. This movement was one of the first things that united all 13 colonies. It encouraged colonists to question authority, whether it was a bishop in a pulpit or a king on a throne. It taught them to think for themselves and fostered a sense of shared purpose that transcended colonial boundaries. When the political crisis with Britain heated up, this pre-existing network of shared belief and independent thought was already in place. And then there was the role of the press and the spread of ideas. The Enlightenment was in full swing, with philosophers like John Locke arguing that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed and that individuals have natural rights to life, liberty, and property. These weren't just abstract theories. They're printed in pamphlets, discussed in taverns, and debated in colonial assemblies. Colonial literacy rates were surprisingly high, and the number of newspapers exploded in the decades leading up to the Revolution. When Britain passed the Stamp Act in 1765, it wasn't just a tax on paper. It was a tax on newspapers, legal documents, and playing cards, the very lifeblood of communication and commerce. This directly targeted the most articulate and influential people in society: lawyers, printers, and merchants. It was a massive political miscalculation. It galvanized opposition and turned printers into revolutionaries, using their presses to spread arguments for liberty and coordinate resistance across the colonies. The pen truly became as mighty as the sword. Finally, let's consider the simple but powerful impact of having British soldiers stationed in American cities during peacetime. After the French and Indian War, Britain left a standing army of 10,000 redcoats in the colonies, ostensibly for protection. But protection from whom? The French were gone. To the colonists, it felt like an occupying force, there to enforce unpopular laws. The Quartering Act, which required colonists to house and supply these soldiers, was seen as a profound insult. It brought the conflict right into their homes. The friction was constant and personal, led to brawls, arguments, and ultimately, tragedies like the Boston Massacre. This daily, visible presence of military power turned an abstract political disagreement into a tense, face-to-face confrontation. It made the king's authority feel intrusive and oppressive in a way that a distant tax law never could. So, when we look back, the American Revolution wasn't a sudden explosion over a few pennies on a pound of tea. It was the culmination of a century of diverging paths. It was about the dream of Western land, the frustration of economic control, the fight for personal privacy against government, overreach, the birth of a new cultural identity, the power of revolutionary ideas, and the resentment of a military occupation. No taxation without representation was the perfect slogan, the spark that lit the fuse. But the powder keg had been filling for a very, very long time. Thanks for joining me on this deeper dive into American history. If you found this fascinating, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories. See you next time.